continue with our committee sessions for this afternoon. Next up is Lake Whatcom Reservoir Natural Resources, and Councilmember Dan Hamill is the chair.
Thank you. Joining me today this afternoon are Council Members Borneman and Knudsen. We have two items before us this afternoon. The first one is a resolution authorizing submittal of an application to the Recreation and Conservation Office for the Little Squalicum Estuary Restoration Project. City of Bellingham Public Works Natural Resources submitted a grant application on July 21st, 2016 to the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program requesting $1,194,343 for construction of the Little Squalicum Estuary Restoration Project in Little Squalicum Park. This authorizing application resolution is required by the Recreation and Conservation Office as part of the grant submittal and review process. The authorizing resolution authorizes the city to submit the grant application and, if grant funding is awarded, to enter into an agreement with the RCO's project agreement. There will be public comment taken on this evening. There were 4 previous council actions on this, and the fiscal impact to the city is a 30% match, so $511,862.
Great, thank you. Ted Carlson, Public Works Department. As Councilmember Hamill mentioned, this is part of a grant application for a estuary project at Little Squalicum Park. The project is part of the Little Squalicum Park Master Plan, so it's been through a public planning process. It's also a project that has ranked very high with the Bellingham Bay Action Team and has been a priority of that group to get this project completed. As you may recall, we've had several issues with funding on this project. It was a project that was previously funded with some Department of Ecology money that was part of the cuts at the state level most recently. We also had a private grant through the Rose Foundation. Unfortunately, that has some timing limitations on it, and we're not likely able to obligate that money. So what we've done is pursued this estuary funding. It's actually fish and wildlife money that's administered through the RCO office. It does require a resolution from the City Council and that it's done in a public meeting, not a public hearing. So we don't have to have an official public hearing. The committee meeting and tonight's public comment meet the requirements of the grant application. If we're successful, we'll find out in October whether or not the project makes the funding list, but it will again be subject to the state budget approval process. So hopefully we'll be successful this time. If we are, the matching money that the city will provide will make the project fully funded, and we would anticipate moving forward with construction next year. So with that, Annalise is here to answer any questions about the project itself or any other questions about funding. We would be happy to answer, but our request is that council pass the resolution tonight.
Thank you. Committee members.
I move the resolution.
Yep. Okay. Further discussion from committee members? Further discussion from council? Councilmember Barker.
What you all used to don't go after a grant unless you really feel confident. Are you thinking we're pretty? I know this has been something near and dear to the area, knowing that we could have a little salmon resting place and to really rejuvenate that area. So are you thinking we're really likely? Should I get my hopes up?
Well, we hate to speculate too much on a grant application process, but we feel very good about the project. As you mentioned, it's been well supported by all of the groups, something that I know our Natural Resources group, as well as the other members of the Bellingham Bay Action Team and Fish and Wildlife are anxious to see happen, so we have our fingers crossed.
Just to follow up with that, we did apply in 2014 for this same funding source. We actually ranked 13th in the state, which was very high on this funding source. It just the way that the legislative budget worked out, we were just below the cutoff for funding, and we think we have a much stronger application this time.
Other questions, comments? Okay, there's a motion before us. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None? All right, we'll move this forward tonight to the full council. Thank you. Second item before us is an update on statewide aquatic invasive species legislation, and here to take us through is Brian Heinrich from the Mayor's Office.
Good afternoon, Brian Heinrich, Mayor's Office. I wanted to come back to you today with the draft legislation that I discussed back at the March joint Lake Whatcom Policy Board meeting. I actually was in Olympia on Wednesday as Fish and Wildlife rolled this legislation out, so you're getting sort of the first glance at it, not much beyond what I've seen, but I did, if you had a chance to see or read the memo, you'll see I pulled out 5 what I felt were notable highlights of the legislation. As I discussed back in March, the main funding source as it's envisioned right now is a diversion of the public utility tax, and the mayor may want to add some comments here, but in this legislative environment, diverting any funding from the general fund could potentially be problematic as we look at the next session. But this was the direction that Fish and Wildlife wanted to go, certainly in working with the group that I had spent much of the year working with. That was identified as a prime source of potential funding. A couple other things. The rest of the dollars would be generated through some new permits, small watercraft, so think of kayaks or canoes or perhaps paddle boards. New permit for non-resident watercraft. So this would mean, as it sounds, folks who are bringing in watercraft from outside the state. Fish and Wildlife would work with State Patrol to set up points of entry inspection programs, so some dollars would head there. That's certainly something that we would support, I think, with our efforts, and I don't know if Ted wants to speak to that or not, but I know the group has done locally a very good job of tracking who uses the lake and where they come from, and having an additional inspection at a point of entry would potentially be very, very useful in tracking AIS. So I did include the legislation. I did also include the agency request, so you can just get a flavor of what that form looks like as what the agency prepared. The next steps are to take this legislation to the governor in about 3 weeks, and it's anticipated that this is the form that will make its way into introduction next session. Again, the mayor may want to add some comments about that process. I guess I would say I believe that it's unlikely that this is the final product that will ultimately be adopted. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or any comments you might have.
Committee members? Council members? Councilmember Barker?
I'd like to hear if you have any feedback, since this is your old house here.
Well, just the same caution that everybody else has already been talking about is with the McCleary decision, funding out of the general fund is going to be very, very, they're going to think very hard about any money that's diverted from the general fund. And one of the issues that's been on our agenda and that is holding up some of our projects right now is the MOTCA funding. So it's hard for us to even, it'll be up to the council to really prioritize what we want our legislators to know are priorities for us, so that we don't kind of skip over something we're doing now for something we're doing now, because I think we're the only city in the state that, or county in the state that is doing something on AIS. So that's why they look to us as the model, and not supporting the legislation in some ways would be very difficult for Fish and Wildlife, since they've kind of used what we've been doing as the model. So I guess I'd just request that that we would support the legislation. Brian's been involved in actually crafting it and giving information. Obviously, prioritizing, what our priorities are is going to come later on for the legislative session, understanding that there's going to be a lot of competing priorities, but it allows the state to at least use a practical example of what has been done when they move forward, which I think is always beneficial to local governments, because something's been tried and it might actually work, rather than we don't know if this will work or not. So we've been a little bit of the self-imposed guinea pig on this issue. So I don't see any reason that this might not be something that we'd like to to support in the future, but I wouldn't get my hopes up.
I think I would add, I neglected to mention that maybe to the mayor's point about our own program being one of the few that exists, there is in the legislation, or in the draft legislation, the creation of a new local AIS management grant. So that would allow those municipalities or agencies that are operating their own local program to apply for funding. And I have every reason to believe, given our program, we'd be a very attractive candidate for that. So, and then maybe just one final point. As in years past, we anticipate bringing forward a work session on our legislative agenda, and I believe we'll look to one of the September meeting dates to bring at least that item forward, looking for adoption perhaps in October.
Councilmember Lillquist, then Barker.
Thank you. So you mentioned this grant program. It says in here that it would be capped at $1 million. But would that $1 million be available in the first year of the program, or would that not be available for 2 or 3 years out?
That's a good question. I don't know that they are that far along in the planning of it, but I believe if we're successful in getting legislation adopted, and this is a component of it, I think it would happen as soon as possible.
Thanks.
This might be for Ted, maybe and Jude. If we were to keep this in mind, knowing this is maybe a direction the state might want to go, that might inform us a bit on our own program to maybe want to keep it robust or in a way that it might fit with this so that we could be in line first for the funding. Is that, so we might want to keep that in the back of our head in our next AIS discussion.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I just have one question. Would this then, if this were to be successful, then would this take the place of the current methodology of how our local program is funded, and would it increase inspection time in terms of the calendar year or hours, that kind of thing?
That's a good question. Ted wants to maybe address that.
Yeah, sure. Ted Carlson, Public Works. I think all of those things would be under consideration if we were able to get some state funding. Certainly, what our starting point would be is to continue our program in the funding model we have, and we will be coming back to council with some proposals on changing our cost recovery model a little bit. Clearly, council would like to see that percentage increased, and we'll be coming back with some options. But if we were also to get some state funding, it would certainly give us the opportunity to broaden our program, perhaps, as you mentioned, increasing the duration of the program, maybe even to a year-round program, or helping us plug some of the other holes that might currently exist in the program. So I wouldn't see it, at least initially, as anything that would do away with our funding model, but rather perhaps increase the robustness of our program. But that would be part of the discussion with the Lake Whatcom Management Group and the council, certainly.
Could enforcement be an augmentation possibility?
Yeah, I think that certainly could be part of it as well. Yeah, working with the sheriff and WDFW and others to increase that enforcement side of it. Yeah, that'd certainly be a component.
Any other questions, comments from council? Okay. And the committee?